In the dim light of May 21st, 1945, 17-year-old Ko Tanaka sought refuge in a limestone cavern on Okinawa. Her white nurse's uniform, once pristine, was now tattered and soiled. Around her, the other members of the Himuri Student Corps murmured prayers as American artillery fire boomed overhead, each detonation showering the cave with falling dust. For 3 months, these young women had served as frontline nurses during what had become the war's most horrific Pacific engagement. They had enlisted anticipating safe duties behind the lines, tending to the wounded in Japan's victorious advance. Instead, they found themselves performing surgery by candlelight in subterranean shelters, their medical supplies reduced to scraps of cloth and desperate hope. Ko's fingers tightened around a pair of worn scissors, the sole surgical tool remaining after weeks of treating soldiers whose injuries were far beyond her limited training. In Naha, her hometown, she had excelled in school, dreaming of becoming a physician after Japan's guaranteed triumph. Now, as American voices echoed from the cave's entrance, speaking in hesitant Japanese about surrender and medical aid, her initial reaction was not fear, but a disbelieving, bitter laugh. How could these purportedly starving, broken Americans offer medical assistance? All she had been taught insisted that American forces subsisted on mere grass and bark, their supply lines obliterated by Japanese naval victories, their soldiers deserting due to starvation. The notion that these same Americans could provide superior medical care to the Imperial Japanese Army seemed so ludicrous that Ko was certain it was a ploy. Yet, when an American medic entered the cave that morning and presented her with a small, brown paper-wrapped package, her entire understanding of the war, her enemies, and her world began to crumble with a single word: chocolate. This is the account of how female Japanese prisoners of war discovered the falsehoods surrounding their American adversaries, and how a simple meal altered the course of history. These young women, the first significant group of Japanese females captured by Americans, had been molded by years of carefully crafted propaganda, portraying American weakness and Japanese spiritual superiority. They were the offspring of a society preparing for total war since the early 1930s, raised on narratives that depicted Japan's ultimate victory as divinely ordained. Sachiko Yamamoto, at 18, had been a devoted member of her school's patriotic society before joining the Himuri Student Corps. Her intelligence and resolve, often lauded by her teachers, were matched by a fierce loyalty to the emperor, instilled through mourning ceremonies, patriotic songs, and lessons on Japan's sacred mission to liberate Asia from Western colonialism. Like her classmates, Sachiko had embraced a worldview depicting Americans as materialistic cowards, softened by an excess of comfort and luxury, incapable of the sacrifice and spiritual dedication of Japanese soldiers. Their industrial might, built on exploitation, was destined to falter against genuine Asian resistance. Most crucially, American food supplies were rumored to be on the verge of collapse. Japanese broadcasts claimed widespread famine in American cities, agricultural systems devastated by labor shortages and poor planning, and undernourished soldiers barely capable of fighting. The Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine actions were said to be strangling American supply lines, forcing the enemy to desperate measures just to feed their own people. For Sachiko and her peers, these beliefs were not mere propaganda. They were tenets of faith that shaped their sense of duty and destiny. As they packed their meager belongings and medical supplies, they genuinely believed they would be serving in secure locations, while Japanese forces secured their inevitable victory over a weakened America. The reality on Okinawa was a stark contrast to their expectations. Michiko Sato had been working at a civilian hospital in Shuri before being conscripted into military service as American forces neared the ancient capital of the Ryukyu Kingdom. At 19, she was slightly older than most Himuri students, possessing more medical experience and a clearer understanding of war's impact. However, even her mature perspective was insufficient preparation for the systematic unraveling of her ingrained beliefs. The Japanese forces she was meant to support were not the invincible warriors of propaganda, but exhausted, underfed soldiers seemingly losing ground daily, despite their valiant efforts. Medical supplies, supposedly abundant, were virtually non-existent, forcing her to perform amputations without anesthesia and improvise bandages from her own clothing. The most alarming aspect was the food situation among Japanese troops, Rice rations, intended to sustain the defenders, dwindled to mere spoonfuls daily, often mixed with sawdust, ground corn, or whatever edible plants could be found in the ravaged landscape. Meat had become a distant memory, and even basic vegetables were scarce as American bombardments made farming impossible and supply ships failed to arrive. We told ourselves the Americans must be suffering even more than we were, Miko would later recall. It was the only way to make sense of it. If our enemies were as weak and hungry as we were told, then our suffering had meaning. If not, what were we fighting for? The psychological strain on these young women, raised to believe in Japanese invincibility, was immense. Each day brought new evidence that the war was not unfolding as promised. Their education offered no framework to comprehend such a possibility. If Japan possessed superior spiritual fortitude, and Americans were as weak and demoralized as they had been led to believe, why were they losing? This contradiction created a cognitive dissonance that the women struggled to resolve through increasingly desperate rationalizations. Perhaps American successes were temporary, aided by Japanese traitors. Perhaps Japanese forces were strategically retreating to lure the enemy into a trap. Perhaps new secret weapons were being developed to turn the tide. But as American forces advanced across Okinawa, systematically dismantling Japanese strongholds despite fierce resistance, these explanations became untenable. The young women found themselves caring not only for wounded soldiers, but also for civilians caught in the crossfire. Elderly people and children, clearly starving and terrified. Refugees recounting tales of entire villages obliterated by American bombing raids. The glorious crusade to liberate Asia was beginning to resemble a catastrophe that had engulfed their entire world. It was against this backdrop of mounting despair and dawning doubt that the initial encounters between female Japanese prisoners and American abundance would occur. When Sachiko Yamamoto emerged from her cave on May 21st, hands raised in surrender, she expected immediate execution or the torture depicted in Japanese propaganda. Instead, she was met by American medics who began tending to the wounded soldiers she had been caring for, providing medical attention far superior to anything she could offer. The Americans seemingly possessed an inexhaustible supply of bandages, antiseptics, and pain medication, resources unavailable to Japanese medical personnel for months. When a medic offered her water and a peculiar-looking food item, Sachiko stared at the strange package with utter bewilderment. The medic repeated a single word in broken Japanese, one she recognized but had never encountered. Chocolto. Sachiko had heard of chocolate, mentioned in pre-war narratives of Western luxury, but had never seen it. In wartime Japan, even the wealthiest families resorted to sweets made from sweet potatoes and rationed sugar substitutes. The idea that enemy soldiers possessed luxury items like chocolate seemed so preposterous that she suspected a trick. When she finally gathered the courage to taste it, her reaction was instantaneous and profound. The rich, sweet flavor was unlike anything she had experienced in years of wartime scarcity. For a moment, she forgot her surroundings and her captors, lost in the simple pleasure of something that tasted good, rather than merely providing sustenance. Then the implication struck her with physical force, and she began to laugh, not from joy, but from the sheer impossibility of the situation. Captured by the enemy she had been taught to fear above all else, she was being given food superior to anything she had tasted in months. The laughter soon turned to tears as she grasped the enormity of what this meant regarding everything she had been told. "I thought it had to be fake," she would later confess to her American interrogators. "Surely the chocolate we heard about in stories could not be real. And surely American soldiers could not have such things when we were told they were starving worse than we were. I convinced myself it must be made from mud or clay, some kind of elaborate deception to make us think they were wealthy, when they were actually as desperate as we were. But the chocolate was real, and it marked the beginning of a series of revelations that would fundamentally dismantle everything these young women had been taught about their enemies and their war. The initial processing of female Japanese prisoners occurred at temporary medical facilities established near the front lines to manage the immense casualties of the Okinawa campaign. Unlike male soldiers, processed through established prisoner-of-war protocols, these women presented unique challenges for American forces, who had limited experience with female enemy combatants. The first hurdle was determining their legal status under international law. Most had served in medical or support roles rather than as combat personnel, rendering their classification as prisoners of war somewhat ambiguous. Some were students pressed into service, others were trained medical professionals who had volunteered for military duty, and a few were civilian employees caught in the fighting when their facilities were overrun. What was immediately apparent, however, was their dire physical condition. Most exhibited severe signs of malnutrition, with gaunt cheeks, sunken eyes, and clothes hanging loosely on their emaciated frames. Many suffered from deficiency diseases. Scurvy, beriberi, and pellagra had become endemic among Japanese forces as supply lines collapsed and medical resources dwindled. Some bore wounds from combat, while others displayed the physical toll of weeks or months spent in underground caves with insufficient food, sanitation, and medical care. The American medical personnel encountering these women were struck not only by their physical state, but by their evident intelligence and education. Many spoke some English, learned in school before the war, and their medical knowledge was often sophisticated, despite the primitive conditions under which they had been working. They were clearly bright, dedicated young women thrust into an impossible situation through no fault of their own. Dr. Sarah Chen, a Chinese-American psychiatrist assigned to assist civilian refugees and prisoners, was among the first to recognize the unique intelligence these women might offer. Unlike male soldiers trained to provide only name, rank, and serial number, if captured, these women possessed intimate knowledge of Japanese civilian society, medical systems, and the daily realities of wartime Japan, invaluable to American intelligence. However, before any formal interrogation could commence, their immediate medical needs had to be addressed. The treatment they received was guided by a blend of military necessity, medical ethics, and simple human compassion, which would profoundly shape their perception of their American captors. The facilities where they were initially housed were basic but comfortable by wartime standards. Clean beds with actual mattresses replaced the bare rock floors of the caves where many had been residing. Running water allowed them to wash properly for the first time in weeks or months. Medical care was provided by qualified doctors and nurses using equipment and supplies far superior to anything available to Japanese forces. But it was the food that had the most immediate and dramatic impact on their understanding of American capabilities and character. Yuki Nakamura was among the last group of medical personnel evacuated from the collapsing Japanese position at Shuri Castle, a significant historical site on Okinawa. As a trained pharmacist, she had managed the increasingly scarce medical supplies for Japanese forces, watching helplessly as essential drugs were depleted and wounded soldiers suffered without adequate pain relief. Her first meal in American custody was served on a metal tray in a makeshift mess hall within a converted school building. She stared at the contents for several minutes, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. There was actual meat, beef that appeared fresh, not the preserved or canned varieties that had become unobtainable in Japan. The vegetables were crisp and colorful, clearly fresh, unlike the wilted, half-rotten produce that had characterized Japanese military meals for months. The bread was soft and white, made from real wheat flour, not the mixture of sawdust, rice hulls, and whatever grain could be found that defined Japanese military bread by 1945. There was butter that was actually yellow, not the gray rancid substitute that had become standard in Japan, and milk that was clearly fresh, not the increasingly rare powdered version. Most astonishing was the quantity. This was not the meticulously measured portions of Japanese military rations, where every grain of rice was precious and every scrap of protein carefully allocated. This appeared to be a normal-sized meal, offering enough food to truly satisfy hunger, rather than merely providing the minimal calories necessary for survival. I could not understand how our enemies could have such food, Yuki reflected later. Everything we had been told about American supply problems, about their agricultural collapse, about their soldiers being reduced to eating grass and bark, it was all clearly false. But if that was false, what else had we been told that was not true? The psychological impact of this realization was immediate and profound. These young women had constructed their entire understanding of the war on the premise that while Japan might endure temporary hardship, their enemies suffered even more. The spiritual strength of the Japanese people would triumph over American material advantages, because those advantages were largely illusory. built on exploitation and destined to collapse under pressure. The abundance they encountered in American custody challenged every assumption they had been raised with. This was not the America of Japanese propaganda, a weak, divided nation whose people were too soft and undisciplined to sustain a prolonged conflict. This was a society that seemed to possess resources and organizational capabilities that Japan could never hope to match. Some women initially refused to eat, convinced that accepting such food would be a betrayal of their duty to the emperor and their fallen comrades. Others feared the food might be poisoned or drugged, designed to make them compliant for interrogation. A few simply could not believe what they were seeing, certain it was an elaborate deception to break their morale and extract information. Tomoko Hayashi, who had worked as a pharmacist at a military hospital in Naha before its evacuation, maintained a partial fast for nearly a week after her capture. She ate rice and vegetables, but refused meat, dairy products, and other items she deemed excessive luxuries inappropriate for prisoners of war. She believed accepting such abundance would somehow corrupt her spirit and make her unworthy of eventual repatriation to Japan. The American medical staff were initially puzzled by this behavior, interpreting it as religious dietary restrictions or simple suspicion about the food's safety. But Dr. Chen, with her understanding of Asian culture and psychology, recognized that the women's reluctance to eat stemmed from something far deeper than practical concerns about nutrition or safety. These young women had been raised in a culture that prized frugality and sacrifice, Dr. Chen would later write in her report to Intelligence Headquarters. The abundance they encountered in our facilities was not just surprising to them, it was psychologically threatening. It challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of the war and the character of their enemies that had been central to their identity and sense of purpose. The breakthrough occurred when Dr. Chen arranged for several Japanese-American personnel to speak with the women in their native language, helping them understand that refusing to eat would not benefit Japan or honor their fallen comrades. These conversations, conducted by individuals familiar with both cultures, helped the women see that accepting American food was not a betrayal of loyalty, but a recognition of reality that might ultimately help their homeland find a path to peace. When Tomoko finally accepted a complete meal, including meat and dairy products, her emotional response was a mix of gratitude for the nourishment her body desperately needed, and despair at what it implied about Japan's prospects in the war. The food was indeed excellent, likely better than anything she had eaten since before the war began, but its very quality forced her to confront the possibility that everything she had been told about American weakness was not merely wrong, but deliberately deceptive. Should our adversaries be capable of providing such sustenance to their captives while engaged in hostilities across numerous fronts? She inquired of Dr. Chen during one of their discussions. What does this reveal about their manufacturing prowess? What insights does it offer into their capacity to persist in combat for an extended duration? This inquiry highlighted the profound psychological evolution these women were undergoing. They began to grasp that the provisions they were receiving were not an anomaly or a stage propaganda effort, but rather a testament to American industrial and agricultural might, dwarfing anything Japan could hope to rival. The effortless plenty they witnessed each day was evidence of a society that could afford to be benevolent towards its foes, due to possessing resources that, by Japanese standards, seemed nearly boundless. This dawning realization frequently triggered profound emotional turmoil, as the women wrestled with aligning their allegiance to Japan with their burgeoning comprehension of the war's true trajectory. Some withdrew into a shell of silence, refusing to articulate their observations or encounters with anyone. Others became consumed by a desperate urge to comprehend how America had attained such prosperity. While Japan grew increasingly beleaguered, they posed intricate questions regarding American farming methodologies, industrial structuring, and resource allocation strategies. The responses they obtained frequently shattered their residual faith in Japanese propaganda and leadership. They discovered that American agricultural output had, in fact, surged during the war years, bolstered by technological advancements and substantial governmental investment in farming infrastructure. Industrial capacity had expanded, not contracted, with the construction of new manufacturing plants and production facilities, even as existing ones were repurposed for military production. Perhaps most disheartening was the gradual revelation that Japanese leadership had been aware of American capabilities all along. These women learned that pre-war Japanese delegations had indeed visited the United States and witnessed its industrial might, agricultural opulence, and natural wealth. The decision to initiate hostilities had been made irrespective of this knowledge, not in ignorance of it. The ramifications of this discovery would continue to echo within their minds as they were transferred to more permanent facilities for in-depth interrogations. Yet, even within these initial weeks of captivity, the groundwork was laid for a transformation that would reshape not only their understanding of the conflict, but their entire worldview and Japan's position within it. The young women who had once scoffed in disbelief at American chocolate were beginning to understand that their amusement stemmed from falsehoods, and that the reality of their adversaries was far more intricate and unsettling than they had been prepared to accept. By July of 1945, the temporary medical quarters housing female Japanese captives had been reconfigured into an entity unprecedented in the Pacific War. These became centers for intelligence acquisition, where young women who had dedicated their lives to serving the emperor were quietly furnishing American forces with the most comprehensive depiction yet of the internal disintegration of Japanese society. This metamorphosis had not been imposed through harsh questioning or duress, but had emerged organically from the simple act of treating these women with compassion and ensuring their adequate nourishment. The arrival of new prisoners from the Japanese home islands yielded even more astonishing disclosures regarding the true state of the empire. Unlike the women from Okinawa, who had been isolated on a distant battlefield, these newcomers had been employed in hospitals and medical facilities within major Japanese urban centers right up until their evacuation or capture. Their accounts of conditions within Japan itself painted a picture of systemic deprivation and societal collapse that far surpassed anything American intelligence had previously comprehended. Nurse supervisor Hano Suzuki arrived at the American detention facility in Hawaii in late July, having been extricated from a hospital in Kobe mere days before the city was slated for another major aerial assault. At 28 years of age, she was considerably older than the majority of the other female detainees, possessing over a decade of experience in military medical establishments and an intimate understanding of the gradual erosion of Japanese medical systems under the strain of total warfare. Her inaugural repast in American custody comprised items that she later recounted not having encountered for over 3 years. Fresh vegetables that were crisp and vibrantly colored, as opposed to wilted and partially decayed. Genuine meat that was tender and flavorful, rather than the tough, sinewy substitutes that had become standard in Japanese institutions. White bread made from actual wheat flour, as opposed to the admixture of sawdust and rice husks that characterized wartime Japanese baking, and dairy products that had not been adulterated with chalk, starch, or other fillers. However, Suzuki's reaction differed from the astonishment and bewilderment exhibited by the younger detainees. Instead of laughter or expressions of awe, she openly wept as she consumed her meal, overwhelmed not merely by the profusion of food, but by what it implied about the pervasive deception that had characterized Japanese wartime propaganda. "I had been informing wounded soldiers that America was teetering on the brink of starvation," she confided to Dr. Chen. "During one of their early exchanges, I had been relaying official assertions about American cities in disarray, about their dwindling food reserves, about their military running out of essential material, and here I was, dining better in an American correctional facility than I had enjoyed in my own home in Japan for years. How many soldiers perished believing the falsehoods I had helped propagate?" Suzuki's knowledge of conditions in the Japanese home islands was comprehensive and devastating. She described infirmaries where surgical procedures were being conducted without anesthesia due to the complete depletion of morphine and other analgesics months prior. She spoke of medical establishments reduced to sterilizing instruments with seikei, as proper disinfectants were no longer accessible through official supply channels. Medical personnel were reusing bandages until they literally disintegrated, and even basic pharmaceuticals, such as aspirin, had become unobtainable outside the black market. Most shockingly, she provided detailed narratives of the systematic starvation affecting even medical practitioners in major Japanese cities. The official dietary allocation for civilians had been reduced to less than 1,000 calories per diem by the summer of 1945. Yet, Even these meager allotments were frequently unavailable due to transportation failures and supply interruptions caused by American aerial bombardments. Medical workers, despite their critical importance to the war effort, were receiving barely sufficient sustenance to sustain basic bodily functions. Suzuki recounted colleagues so weakened by hunger they could scarcely stand during lengthy operations, medical students who had abandoned their studies due to a lack of physical stamina, and nurses who had succumbed to malnutrition while tending to patients. The irony was profound, she explained to Dr. Chen. We were tasked with healing individuals, yet we were all slowly perishing from hunger ourselves. The injured soldiers we treated were often in superior physical condition than the medical staff attending to them, as they at least received military rations, however inadequate. But even those were diminishing in quantity and nutritional value each month. The stark contrast with American abundance became even more pronounced when Suzuki began to comprehend the magnitude of American medical capabilities. The facility where she was being held possessed superior equipment to most major hospitals in Japan, featuring functional X-ray machines, properly sterilized surgical instruments, and access to medications that had become entirely unavailable within the Japanese Empire. When she learned that comparable facilities existed throughout the American military apparatus, supporting not only prisoners but millions of American servicemen globally, her grasp of the strategic equilibrium began to fundamentally shift. I realized we were not engaged in conflict against an adversary grappling with shortages as we were, she reflected later. We were fighting an enemy so replete with every commodity that they could afford to treat their prisoners more favorably than Japan was treating its own doctors and nurses. It was not a contest between equals. It was a complete disparity that could only culminate in one manner. The intelligence derived from Suzuki's testimony was immediately recognized by American analysts, who utilized her detailed knowledge of Japanese medical conditions to refine their understanding of enemy capabilities and civilian morale. Her accounts of hospital deficiencies provided crucial insights into the efficacy of American submarine warfare against Japanese maritime traffic. Meanwhile, her descriptions of medical personnel morale assisted American leadership in comprehending the psychological repercussions of the strategic bombing campaigns on Japanese society. However, perhaps most significantly, her emotional responses to American treatment offered American decision-makers a glimpse into the mentality of educated Japanese civilians who, having supported the war effort, were beginning to question its foundational tenets. Her tears over simple meals, her astonishment at American medical prowess, her deepening comprehension of the vast disparity in resources between the two nations, all suggested that Japanese society might be more amenable to capitulation than official propaganda indicated. The summer of 1945 witnessed a continuous influx of new female detainees from various sectors of the disintegrating Japanese Empire, each cohort bringing fresh revelations concerning the deteriorating conditions across Japanese-controlled territories. A contingent of military nurses apprehended during the evacuation of Japanese medical facilities in the Philippines provided detailed accounts of the final collapse of Japanese medical services in the occupied regions. These women described hospitals that had been abandoned when Japanese forces could no longer provide even the most rudimentary supplies, leaving wounded soldiers and ailing civilians entirely without medical care. They recounted evacuation vessels so overcrowded and undersupplied that passengers succumbed to starvation and dehydration during the voyage back to Japan, their bodies cast overboard to prevent the spread of contagion among the survivors. Their narratives of Japanese military medical practices in the war's final months depicted a systematic breakdown extending far beyond mere supply shortages. Medical personnel were compelled to make impossible choices regarding which patients to treat and which to forsake, based not on medical prognosis but on resource availability. Wounded soldiers were left to perish not because their injuries were untreatable, but due to the absence of bandages, antiseptics, or pain medication for their care. In certain instances, medical workers were discreetly instructed to euthanize severely injured patients to conserve scarce medical provisions for those with a greater likelihood of recovery. These directives were never formalized in writing, yet the implication was unequivocal. Japanese medical resources had become so depleted that even the wounded could not all receive treatment. The psychological toll of these experiences was palpable in every facet of these women's demeanor and discourse. They were not only physically emaciated and exhausted, but also emotionally scarred by months or years of laboring under insurmountable conditions, while being assured they were serving a glorious cause destined for ultimate triumph through spiritual fortitude and sacrifice. Dr. Chen and her colleagues meticulously documented numerous instances of women experiencing what they termed an ideological collapse, a complete disintegration of faith in the Japanese war effort, precipitated by the convergence of their traumatic experiences and their exposure to American capabilities and treatment. These women often progressed through predictable phases of psychological response: initial disbelief that American abundance was genuine, followed by indignation at having been misled regarding enemy capabilities, then despondency as they contemplated the implications for Japan's war prospects, and finally, acceptance that continued resistance was not only futile but actively detrimental to their populace. The sustenance provided in American facilities served as a daily emblem of the vast chasm separating Japanese propaganda from American reality. Each meal was a demonstration that American industrial and agricultural capacity remained not only intact but flourishing, despite years of global conflict waged on multiple continents. The nonchalant manner in which American personnel handled items the Japanese considered luxuries, discarding bread crusts without a second thought, setting aside vegetables that were slightly wilted, serving generous portions without apparent concern for waste, offered continuous evidence of American confidence in their resource base and production capabilities. Some of the women became consumed with understanding how America had achieved such prosperity while Japan had grown increasingly desperate. Their inquiries during medical examinations and informal discussions frequently revealed a sophisticated grasp of economic and industrial principles. Despite their medical backgrounds, they sought knowledge about American agricultural techniques, industrial organization, transportation networks, and resource allocation strategies that enabled such productivity even during wartime. The explanations they received from sympathetic American personnel often served to completely dismantle their faith in Japanese leadership and propaganda. They learned that American agricultural output had actually seen an increase during the war years, supported by advancements in technology, superior fertilizers, and substantial government investment in farming infrastructure and transportation. Industrial capacity had expanded rather than diminished, with new factories and military production operating at unprecedented scales. The submarine warfare, intended to cripple American supply lines, had failed to significantly impact either military or civilian food provisions. While American submarines systematically decimated Japanese merchant shipping, reducing Japan to a state of near starvation, the aerial bombardments that Japanese propaganda dismissed as ineffective had, in fact, devastated Japanese industrial output and transportation networks, rendering it impossible to distribute even the reduced quantities of food that were still being produced. Perhaps most critically, Japanese diplomatic and trade delegations had visited America and witnessed its industrial might, agricultural wealth, and seemingly inexhaustible natural resources. Government officials had toured American factories, farms, and educational institutions, meticulously documenting the technological and organizational advantages that contributed to America's vastly superior productivity compared to Japan's. The decision to embark on war had been predicated on the flawed assumption that American prosperity and comfort had rendered its populace too indolent and undisciplined to sustain a prolonged conflict, and that Japanese spiritual superiority would triumph over American material advantages before those advantages could be fully mobilized. They were aware, Suzuki stated during a particularly emotional conversation with Dr. Chen. Our leaders knew America's capabilities, and they chose to wage war regardless. They dispatched millions to their deaths fighting an adversary they knew we could not defeat. How can such a thing be possible? How can leaders betray their own people so completely? This question troubled many of these women as they struggled to reconcile their loyalty to Japan with their burgeoning understanding of the war's true nature and its inevitable conclusion. Some retreated into solitary contemplation, eschewing any discussion of their observations or experiences with either Americans or fellow Japanese. Others became nearly frantic in their pursuit of understanding the decision-making process that had led Japan into such a disastrous conflict, posing detailed questions about American politics, economics, and strategic planning. A select few began to perceive their role in furnishing intelligence to American forces as a means of hastening the war's end and alleviating the suffering of their compatriots. These women understood that every piece of information they provided regarding Japanese capabilities, resources, and morale might assist American leadership in making decisions that would conclude the conflict sooner rather than later, potentially preserving thousands of Japanese lives. The transformation these women underwent during their confinement in American custody was often striking and profoundly moving to witness. Most had arrived severely underweight, exhibiting clear indications of chronic malnutrition, stress, and exhaustion. Within weeks of receiving adequate sustenance and medical attention, they began to appear healthier than they had in years. Some gained upwards of 30 pounds, their features regaining fullness, and their energy levels returning to something approaching normal. This physical improvement was frequently accompanied by behavioral changes that mirrored their emotional healing and evolving perspective on the war. Women who had initially been suspicious and withdrawn, convinced they faced torture or execution, gradually became more open and communicative as they realized their captors intended to treat them with dignity and respect. Some developed an interest in their surroundings, posing questions about American culture and society that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances. Others began to assist with minor duties within the facility, leveraging their medical expertise to aid in the care of fellow prisoners or even wounded American personnel when requested. This cooperation was occasionally met with apprehension by American military officials who harbored concerns regarding security breaches or propaganda efforts aimed at influencing American personnel. However, the medical staff directly interacting with these women recognized that their conduct reflected genuine shifts in their understanding of the war and their evolving relationship with their former adversaries. These were not women who had been brainwashed or coerced into collaboration, but intelligent individuals who had drawn logical conclusions from their observations and experiences. They had firsthand witnessed the devastating impact of total warfare on Japanese society, and their exposure to American abundance and humane treatment had clarified that Japan lacked the resources to sustain protracted hostilities without courting utter annihilation. The conversations that transpired during mealtimes often yielded intelligence more valuable than formal interrogation sessions could have produced. The relaxed ambiance of shared dining, coupled with the psychological impact of experiencing American plenty, fostered an environment where these women felt comfortable articulating their deepest anxieties concerning the war and its ramifications for Japanese society. Many revealed detailed knowledge of conditions within Japanese cities that had endured intense aerial bombardments, their accounts of hospitals overwhelmed with burn victims, of medical personnel struggling to manage vast casualties without adequate supplies or facilities, and of entire urban areas being evacuated due to their inability to sustain human habitation, provided American intelligence analysts with crucial insights into the effectiveness of the strategic bombing campaign. Further insights into Japanese military medical practices illuminated critical weaknesses within enemy forces. Their accounts detailed widespread malnutrition afflicting Japanese soldiers, medical units lacking fundamental supplies, and evacuation protocols that frequently resulted in more fatalities than the initial combat. These descriptions enabled American commanders to grasp the true condition of Japanese military strength and morale. Perhaps the most significant contributions these women offered were their observations regarding Japanese civilian sentiment toward the war. Their narratives suggested that public backing for continued hostilities was considerably less robust than Japanese state propaganda portrayed. They spoke of mounting weariness among medical personnel, increasing doubt concerning official pronouncements of imminent victory, and quiet discussions about the potential necessity for Japan to pursue peace terms to avert utter annihilation. The recurring themes from these conversations depicted a society under immense strain, where even the most ardent proponents of the war effort were beginning to question if the ongoing resistance justified the profound human suffering. The systemic collapse of medical services, the pervasive malnutrition impacting even essential staff, and the declining spirits of educated citizens who had previously supported the war effort all pointed towards Japan being closer to capitulation than official communiques indicated. As August of 1945 approached, and American leaders deliberated on whether to proceed with the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands or to seek alternative avenues for concluding the conflict, the intelligence provided by these female captives acquired paramount significance. Their understanding of Japanese domestic circumstances, military capacities, and civilian morale was instrumental in shaping strategic choices that would ultimately determine the war's final trajectory. When the atomic bombs were deployed on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in early August, followed by the Soviet Union's declaration of war against Japan, the female Japanese prisoners, having experienced American abundance, were among the first to comprehend the full ramifications of these events. They had witnessed firsthand the vast industrial and technological prowess that made such weaponry possible, and they understood that Japan possessed no defense against such overwhelming power. Many of these women became unofficial proponents of Japanese surrender in the war's concluding weeks, not due to coercion by their captors, but because they had seen enough to realize that continued defiance would only inflict further hardship upon their people. Their discussions with newly arrived prisoners frequently centered on persuading them that American treatment was humane and that capitulation did not signify the eradication of Japanese culture or society. Following Emperor Hirohito's announcement of Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, the women who had once cherished chocolate found themselves in the unique position of bridging the gap between former adversaries. Many volunteered their services as interpreters and cultural advisors during the initial post-war period, leveraging their medical expertise and language abilities to assist American occupation forces in comprehending Japanese society and customs. Their narratives began to surface in Japanese media during the early occupation, offering vital context for understanding how the war had truly concluded. The stark contrast between Japanese privation and American plenty, as experienced by these women, helped elucidate to the Japanese populace why their government had opted for surrender over the promised fight to the death that had been a cornerstone of wartime propaganda. The enduring impact of these women's experiences extended far beyond the immediate post-war era. Many returned to Japan and became champions of international understanding and cooperation, utilizing their singular perspectives to foster peace and reconciliation between former enemies. Their intimate knowledge of how propaganda could distort reality, coupled with their personal discovery of humanity among those they had been taught to despise, transformed them into powerful voices against the militarism and nationalism that had precipitated such widespread devastation. Sachiko Yamamoto returned to Okinawa and eventually assumed the leadership of nursing at a prominent hospital in Naha, maintaining correspondence with several American medical professionals who had cared for her during her internment. In the 1960s, she was instrumental in establishing an exchange program that facilitated American nurses' studies in Japan while enabling Japanese nurses to undertake training in American hospitals. Hanako Suzuki emerged as a leading advocate for international medical cooperation in Japan, contributing to the establishment of humanitarian medical missions across Asia and serving on the boards of multiple international health organizations. She frequently recounted how her exposure to American medical practices during her captivity had revealed new possibilities for patient care and healthcare system organization. The saga of female Japanese prisoners of war and their encounters with American sustenance during World War II ultimately illustrates the profound influence of basic human kindness in overcoming even the most meticulously crafted systems of animosity and deceit. These young women had been indoctrinated by propaganda that depicted their adversaries as monstrous and devoid of humanity. Yet, they encountered caregivers who treated them with a tenderness and generosity that their own government had failed to provide in the war's waning years. Their initial amusement at American plenty, the apparent implausibility that enemies could possess such wealth while Japan suffered, gradually yielded to the realization that such abundance represented not weakness, but strength. Not accident, but a testament to industrial and organizational capabilities beyond Japan's reach. More significantly, they learned that a populace capable of maintaining its humanity even towards designated enemies, possessed values that transcended mere military might. The metamorphosis of these women, from adherents of Japanese propaganda to advocates for global understanding, underscores the inherent fragility of even the most sophisticated ideological control mechanisms when confronted with direct empirical experience. No amount of schooling or indoctrination could withstand the simple verity revealed by sharing meals with former adversaries who chose to treat them as human beings deserving of respect and care. The chocolate that had seemed unattainable to Kot Tanaka in that Okinawan cave, the beef stew that had moved Hanako Suzuki to tears, the fresh bread that had compelled so many of these women to re-examine their deepest convictions. These unpretentious foodstuffs became instruments of change more potent than any instrument of warfare. They unveiled truth where falsehoods had predominated, fostered understanding where animosity had thrived, and demonstrated that even amidst total conflict, humanity could triumph over ideology. Ultimately, the female Japanese prisoners, who had initially laughed at American provisions upon their first encounter, discovered something far more valuable than mere sustenance. They learned that abundance shared with enemies, benevolence extended to those deemed adversaries, and dignity preserved even in triumph were not indicators of weakness, but manifestations of a strength that no military force could confer. Their journey from laughter to tears to profound comprehension stands as a testament to the enduring capacity of human connection to surmount even the most meticulously constructed impediments of hatred and misapprehension.